Hello class, this video is made to address Punnett squares. Throughout this video, we hope to be able to better inform you of what a Punnett square is and how to do it. Before we can start with talking about Punnett squares, we need to address a few things. First is I want you to look at yourself, maybe in a mirror, and then look at a picture or someone else. You'll realize you have a lot of differences. You sure you have a few things in similar, but there's a lot of things different, like the color of your hair, or the color of your eyes, or the way your fingers bend, or your height. All of these are a result of us all having different traits. Now, you may ask, how do we get these different traits? Well, we get them from our parents. A trait is made up of two genes. And no, I'm not talking about the genes you wear. I'm talking about genes spelled with a G. These genes are parts of our DNA that determine how we look in certain ways. Everyone gets two genes from their parents, and one from your mom and one from your dad. When those genes are put together, they form a certain trait. Now, there are two types of genes. There is called a dominant and a recessive. Now, this doesn't mean that a dominance gene is better than a recessive gene. It just means that when these two genes appear together, they tend to go in the dominant's favor. So our first vocab word is the dominant gene. A dominant gene is represented by a capital letter like B or the letter Y. These genes are called dominant genes because when matched with a recessive gene, the trait is more visible. One example, though this isn't a very good example, would be between genders. XX is a female, but XY is a male. Thus, the Y trait is dominant to the X. And once again, this is in no means has anything to do with saying that the Y trait is better than the X, but rather, when the traits appear together, it takes the dominant gene appears. Now, I said this wasn't a great example because the gender isn't really defined by a trait so much as by an entire chromosome, but because in the last lesson we did cover the idea of sexual reproduction and what makes male and female in human with XX and XY, I figured it was easy to start you off with this. However, there is no such thing as a YY, so you really can't be used much of an example beyond this. And then you have, the next word is recessive genes. Recessive gene is represented by a little letter, like the little b, or the letter X. These genes are called recessive because when matched with the dominant gene, the trace is less visible. This is a better example. Say eye color. Some of you might have blue, some might have brown, green, or hazel, but let's just primarily focus on blue and brown eyes. Brown eyes can be either BB with big B's or BB, while blue eyes can only be the little b's. Now, remember, because we get genes from both parents, one of these genes represents from your mom or dad, and the other gene represents from the other. So, if you have two dominant genes, or one dominant gene and a recessive gene, you will have brown eyes. But if you have two recessive genes, you have blue eyes. Now, if your eyes aren't brown or blue, this is okay because there's a few more genes that determine eye color, such as green and hazel. But for simplicity, we'll just cover this. So now that you know both types of genes, we can now look at the difference or the different combinations. There are three combinations in each with their own title. The first one is called homozygous dominant. This trait represented by two dominant genes. This trait is often represented by two capital letters like BB or XX. Notice how they are big. Offspring of a homozygous dominant will either be homozygous dominant or heterozygous. They will have one trait that fits either one of those. Now the next one down is heterozygous. Now there's no need for a dominant or recessive because there's only one type of heterozygous. A heterozygous trait represented by one dominant and one recessive gene. These traits often represented by big B and a little b, or big X and a little, that should be an X. Big X and a little x. The results of this trait are the same as if they were a homozygous dominant. However, the offspring of the heterozygous could be homozygous dominant, heterozygous, or homozygous recessive. Now, when I say this has the same as if they were homozygous, go back to the eyes example. If you are heterozygous, as in you have one capital B and one little b to represent your eye color, then you're going to have brown eyes, and you're going to just look like a homozygous dominant. And then you have homozygous recessive, a trait represented by two recessive genes. This trait is often represented by little b, or little y. Offspring of a homozygous recessive trait will either be heterozygous or homozygous recessive. In other words, if you have blue eyes, you can't have a child who will be homozygous dominant. They can only be heterozygous or homozygous recessive. So now we're going to move into the Punnett squares. I have two Punnett squares here, so I figured we'd do the first one together, and then I'll let you do the other one, and you can pause the video as you do it, and when you're ready, I will tell you which one it is, or I'll help you through it. So the first one we'll do together. So let's say one parent, and we'll work with eye color because that's been a good example all day. One parent has, we'll say, brown eyes, but they won't just have brown eyes, they will have homozygous dominant brown eyes, so they will have two big B's. And the other parent, they're going to be homozygous recessive, which means they're going to have two little b's. Now you see how that works? How when the trait is, so a homozygous trait looks like this, and a homozygous recessive looks like this. But if this was a heterozygous, then you could easily make that B into a big B, and you'd have a heterozygous trait. So a Punnett square works simply by matching up all the possible combinations. So in this case, if we were to look at the possible kid outcome, all of them are going to be this. And before I finish writing, can you guess what it is, what the name is? If you said heterozygous, you'd be right. The child between somebody with a homozygous dominant and a homozygous recessive towards blue and brown eyes would always have a heterozygous child. Now, like I said, if this was a heterozygous and this was a B, what do you think that would have the effect? Well, it's simple. Down through here, these would change and these would become B, so now the child could either be a heterozygous dominant or a homozygous dominant or a heterozygous. Now, I'm going to set up the next one, and you're going to pause the video to see if you can figure out. This time I'm going to use I, as in your index finger. If you take a look at your index finger, you'll notice that either sometimes, like mine, it bends inwards, and sometimes, unlike mine, it will go straight. This is a result of a trait. Now, I believe that if the finger curves, it means you have a homozygous recessive. And if it goes straight, you have either a homozygous dominant or a heterozygous. So let's assume two parents in this case are both heterozygous. I would like you to try to fill in the graph, or fill in the Punnett square, and tell me, if they had 4 children, what do you think, what would be the possibilities of those children look like, or what would their fingers be like? Alright, so I assumed you figured it out, and here's what you would get. You would get a homozygous dominant. You would get 1 heterozygous, 2 heterozygous, and a homozygous recessive. Now, if I was to ask what they would look like, you would say that 3 out of 4 times the child will have a straight finger, but 25%, or 1 out of 4 times, it will have a slightly curved finger. And by no means are these Punnett squares telling you what the offspring will look like, but rather the chances of what the offspring will look like. So you could have, or this couple could have 4 children, and they could all have curved fingers because statistics are just saying that. Even though it's unlikely, it's still possible just as much if they could all have homozygous dominant, or they could all be heterozygous. the possibilities are endless. These things are just meant to help you chart it out better. I hope this video was productive and helpful for you. And if you have any questions, please address me in class tomorrow. Thanks.